Well, it's good to see you again as we talk about different transitions that we find in our life. We have seen many different types of transitions, and I think it's important to recognize that not all of them are the same. There are a lot of stories. The Bible is full of stories. Each one of us has our own story. And the transitions that take place in those stories are altogether different. We might like to characterize the transition that takes place in Christianity as being only one kind of transition or one kind of story, but the truth is that there are many different kinds of stories. And if you have so many different kinds of stories, there may be different ways in which this transition takes place. All of us end up with God. All of us have some basic things about it. But I want to be able to look at the transitions that we face in our life, as well as some of the ones that we see in the Bible. When we start looking at the transition that goes from sinner to disciple, we're able to see something that happens with certain people. We looked at Zacchaeus last week with tax collectors, and I want to continue to look at tax collectors this week because they represent one of the biggest groups of sinners that Jesus knew during his time. It's when everyone recognized them as being a sinner. And it wasn't just Jesus. All the people around knew. The people themselves knew. They classified themselves as sinners. And so they were not offended or surprised when someone referred to them or shunned them, and they expected it. After all, they had chosen to work for the Romans. They had chosen to take money from their own people, and that can always seem offensive to us. And there wasn't a regulation on them as far as how much to take, and so many times they took extra and they did cheat the people. I suppose it's a little bit offensive because you realize that they sent a tax collector to collect from you. It was not a matter of figure out how much you owe, send that in. Tax collectors had a little bit of force behind them. And so it's important for us to recognize the way people saw them. But everyone saw them as a sinner. Well, what transition can we get from these people? Zacchaeus, Jesus saw him up in a tree and invited himself to go to Zacchaeus' house. And Zacchaeus, we see, was shunned by many people. Didn't really seem to have any friends, didn't have a way to find Jesus. The story that we want to talk about today isn't the same way at all. It's a story about Matthew. In fact, Matthew had a lot of friends. Matthew 9:9. And Jesus passed on from there and saw a man called Matthew sitting in a tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." And so Jesus asked Matthew to follow him. Oddly enough, Matthew packs up his office and says, "Yes, I'm going to follow." Immediately, he follows Jesus. He's in a very different setting than Peter or Andrew and the fishing boat, but we see him being able to leave his corporate office where he has been collecting taxes, and now he goes and he's going to follow Jesus. The transition that Matthew goes through is a little bit different than the others. We see Matthew with Jesus, and he's in a great house. And there's lots of other people who come to be with them. Lots of other tax collectors, maybe because Matthew is there as a tax collector. And it says tax collectors and sinners. Well, how would you know which person's a sinner? Unless these are going to be obvious sins, and it's going to be people who aren't even trying to do what's right. You know that they're trying to just do whatever they want. They're not following God. And it seems as if that's what happens, though, isn't it? That certain people collect together. And so sinners would collect together, maybe the same way that righteous people would collect together. we see different people collecting together for different sports or different activities. All those people who feel condemned or feel like they're sinners might want a place where they belong. And so they would go with Matthew. And it seems to be a big party. It seems to be a great place where Matthew has a lot of friends. And Jesus has gone to that place. He is with Matthew, and here's where the transition takes place. That's how he is going to make this transition. It seems as if he may have asked Jesus to come with him, or at least he's with Jesus, and they find themselves together in this great house. And Jesus is able to meet Matthew's friends. Well, there are other people who are there along with Matthew and along with his friends, and the other people are the Pharisees. Now, there's several different approaches to how to follow God. Some people do only what they have to, and some people do everything they can possibly do in order to make sure of their salvation. Well, the Pharisees were on the extreme edge. They were wanting to do everything they could possibly do in order to not be like all their ancestors, not be like the people who were condemned for their idolatry, not be like the people who we see in the Old Testament, who had been punished by God so many times. And so now we don't read much about idolatry. What we read about is this idea of being a Pharisee and the extreme observance and obedience to God and to his word. I mean, extreme obedience. It wasn't just a little bit. They were watching for anybody who did anything wrong. And certainly we see that in this situation where they're watching for Jesus, as Jesus is now eating with tax collectors and sinners. How could he do that? And so they're just shocked by this, that a man who had claimed to be Messiah would associate with those kind of people. They don't really understand why he would do that. For Matthew, it's a very important part of this transition. He and Jesus are together. Jesus meets his friends. He meets Matthew where Matthew lives. And so the question comes from the Pharisees, or maybe it's just a sly comment off to the side, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? As if it would rub off on him, as if it would cause some kind of sin to come on Jesus. The Pharisees' idea was to stay as far away from sin as possible. In fact, they were extreme in their observance of certain laws. And they tried to show it. They tried to show it in the way that they dress. They would make sure that the way in which they dressed had significance. And so when we look at the Pharisees or the priests, they had certain garments that they were supposed to wear. They had certain things that they did. Tithing was a part of what happened in the Old Testament. And so they would give a tenth to God of everything that they got. For the Pharisees, that meant they would give a tenth to God of everything that they got, down to the fact that if they bought a bag of wheat, they would tithe every single seed. And if you got extra seeds, it was, okay, this many for God, this many for me. And so they were very extreme in the way in which they did things in their observance of the law. They were almost too good. And when you think about that, it's not who Jesus wanted them to be, because they come with this attitude of superiority and this attitude of condemnation. Do we kind of have that idea sometimes? Don't we kind of think things trickle down? In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is going to say, bad company corrupts good morals. Don't we believe that? Didn't you hear that from your parents? Haven't you said that to your kids? That there's people to be careful of. I want you to stay away from certain kinds of people because of the way in which they act, and I don't want you to be influenced by them. And so we might try to protect our children in that way by asking them to be careful in who they're around. Well, isn't that what the Pharisees are doing? Isn't that the truth? That the more you're around evil people and the more you're around wickedness, the more you're going to be like them. Is Paul wrong in what Paul says? Bad company does corrupt good morals. Well, Paul is right. Bad company does corrupt good morals, and especially if that bad company is the bigger influence. And certainly that's what happens, is that we find ourselves in a weaker position and they seem to have a much bigger influence on us. And so we would become corrupted by their influence of us. So is Jesus in danger here of being corrupted by being in this room with sinners? Well, no, he's not, because it doesn't apply with Jesus. It depends on who is the stronger. You see, evil is in danger when it's in the presence of Jesus. And then it becomes the opposite. Good things can influence bad behavior, because Jesus' whole attention is to discipleship, that you would follow me. And if you follow me and become around me, then you will find the grace of God and you will find this holiness and you will become what God wants you to be. And that goes completely against the other idea that, well, if you're ever around bad people, you're going to turn out bad. No, but when you're with God and with especially what Jesus has, you have the chance of becoming something good. Now, it depends on who's the stronger of the two, and usually we're the weaker ones. And so, yes, we should be careful about being around a bad influence. And I'm not trying to say that that's wrong in any way. Do be careful about that. But also recognize we can be the force for good. We can be the influence of good. And what the Pharisees see is Jesus is there with sinners. And that's all they see. It's not about anything else. They see Jesus is there with sinners. And so they have to come to grips with, well, what does it mean? It means that Jesus is being corrupted. No, it means Matthew is being called. And they are watching the transition for Matthew as he deals with his past and as he deals with all those things that we see have happened to him. And now he comes to follow Jesus. What they do not realize is this is the last time Matthew will see these friends. It's the last time that he will be around them. And we don't see any other time when Matthew goes back to these old friends. Certainly now he's following Jesus and being able to do the things that Jesus wants. And so he leaves the office, he leaves his home, he leaves where he is, and he goes to be around Jesus all the time. Jesus has been the influence for good in Matthew's life. And so Matthew isn't a tax collector anymore. They're still trying to keep him with that old crowd, and Matthew isn't the tax collector anymore. He's resigned that job, and now he is a disciple with Jesus. And so he has changed and transitioned from where he was into a whole different place. And now he's following what Jesus wants him to do. Well, as they grumble against Jesus and as they grumble against the things that Jesus is doing here about him being around all of these sinners, Jesus is going to respond to what they say. He says, only the sick man needs a doctor. That's why we would go to the doctors, because we're sick. We don't make an appointment just to go hang out just because he's a nice guy or something like that. It's not just so you can get the sucker. You kind of run out of suckers after you get a little bit older. And so Jesus is trying to say, what I came is to those who are sick. I didn't come to people who already think they have everything together, but to those who know that they don't. To those who know that they're sinners, who know that there's something wrong with their life, and they are ready to make a change and ready to do something different. And so Jesus says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I didn't come to call the righteous. I came to call sinners. Well, his quote out of Isaiah 6:6, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And what Hosea is talking about there is, I desire people to love me, not just do ritual things. And for some reason, they had gotten to the point where they felt like, well, as long as I obeyed and as long as I did it, then what does it matter what I was thinking at the time or how I felt at the time? I did what I was supposed to, and that's all that matters. I put in my time, that's all I was supposed to do. And so they had taken a very strict view of the law and of keeping this law, But it's like us, if the law said go to church, then we would show up exactly when it started and we would leave exactly when it left, and we would not have to listen to anything. But just the fact that we were there in that place meant we have fulfilled the duty that we were supposed to have done. And therefore, God should be happy with that. We wouldn't have listened to anything. We wouldn't have learned anything. We wouldn't have encouraged anybody. And Jesus is saying, that's not what I want. I don't want just the sacrifice. And that's what they had back in their time as their way of worship, was to offer a sacrifice. Okay, I offered the sacrifice you told me to. Here's your lamb. Burn it up. Okay, I'm good. He says, no, I'd rather have some compassion. And actually, Hosea says, I'd rather have love than sacrifice. And so when we see what Hosea is talking about and what Jesus is talking about, he says, I want the heart of the people. I want you to understand that you would have compassion on a man who feels like he's a sinner, who is trying to make this transition. And he's following Jesus and he's doing what's right. And that there would be some kind of love and compassion for someone who's trying to accomplish those things. But they don't know what that means. And that's why Jesus doesn't try to tell them. He says, you need to go learn what this means. And he's going to give them the Old Testament quote, because that's what they respect. That's what they know. And so Jesus says, I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. We can see that with Matthew. He is trying to call Matthew. Matthew is obviously a sinner. Everybody recognizes that he's a sinner, but Matthew is making this transition to be a disciple of Jesus. And so that's the way it goes, from being a sinner into being a disciple. And that transition is what Matthew's trying to do. But do we really think that? You see, one of the stories that Jesus is going to tell in Matthew 25 is around the judgment time, and he talks about the idea of there being sheep and goats. And when Jesus comes, he will divide sheep from goats, and the goats he will put on his left hand, the sheep he will put on his right hand. The goats are going to be lost and going away. The sheep are going to be the righteous, and they get to go with him. Well, doesn't that mean Jesus came for the righteous then? Seems possible to me. I mean, that seems like what we would be saying. And so I can see how they might have gotten that idea, that Jesus comes and he calls the righteous, or he comes and judgment is about those who are righteous. And so what is this Jesus talking about by saying, I came to call sinners? But Jesus, some of your teaching is about you being with the righteous. Well, I think it's a matter of timing and how we understand this, and you're probably way ahead of me on this already. Because Jesus didn't say that as far as the final judgment is concerned. He came at that time to call sinners to follow him. But they're not going to stay sinners. They're going to transition away from being sinners into being the righteous. And so when Jesus comes, like his parable says, at the end of the age, and there is the judgment time, then you might see Jesus came for the righteous. But at this time, and where we are, he came to call sinners. He came to call sinners that they might not be sinners anymore, that they might follow him, and that they might become the righteous. And so we need to make sure we understand exactly the time period we're talking about, because it's easy enough for us to become like the Pharisees and want to be around the righteous. That's who Jesus is coming back for. But Jesus came to call sinners. And we are still in that place where he is calling sinners to himself. And so we help them get to Jesus. Luke 18:9. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I would fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. And so Jesus tells this story about some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. Well, why would you trust in yourself that you're righteous? I think we can see how this works. We know we've made mistakes in the past, and so we're going to try to be better, and we're not going to try to make those same mistakes again. And so, as we make those decisions, we are going to be better people. We are not going to follow that same thing. We are going to do something that is much better. We are not going to live that same way. And so, we are concentrated on our behavior, and we're doing fairly well. We're doing good. And so, we've got to congratulate ourselves a little bit. I mean, after all, we're successful. God must be proud of us. And so we can imagine God being proud of us for all the progress we've made compared to where we were. And so we have done a great job of putting away certain things. Maybe we were cussing a lot, we don't cuss anymore. And maybe we cheated a lot and we don't cheat anymore. And maybe we lied a lot and we don't lie anymore. And so we're able to say we do good things. And now we're putting in some other things where we've helped people. And so, God, you ought to be proud of me. I've helped people now. And we can see this as a way that people do this on their own. And so they trusted in themselves that they were righteous. In other words, they were doing their own righteousness. They didn't really need the grace of God because they had been able to change their own behavior into what God wanted. And after all, isn't the goal what God wanted? And so if they were able to do all of this, they're able to see this is what makes the difference. And so as they change this behavior, they are able to congratulate themselves. And this guy does. He says, I'm thankful that I'm not like some of the other people. And he lists a whole bunch of sins. In fact, you can see the guy standing over there. I'm glad I'm not like him because he looks pretty miserable. And it's a congratulations for what he's been able to do for himself. And we shouldn't discount this too much because he has made tremendous progress in adjusting his behavior and doing good things and putting on good things. He fasts twice a week. He gives some positives. I tithe of everything that I get, right down to the last seed of everything that I get. I pay tithes, 10%. And you don't find that kind of dedication in our world much anymore. And so he has done a lot of things in order to be righteous before God. He maybe could look at that and say, I'm thankful that I've come this far. But what he does instead is to judge somebody else. I'm thankful I'm better than him. I'm thankful I'm not like that person. And so when we look at it that way, he's thankful for what he's been able to accomplish on his own. And that's not really the point. Because now he's taking his own pride for his own salvation, for his own righteousness that he's been able to find in himself. And that isn't where God's salvation is found. After all, he's made himself his own Savior, and he has become the most important thing in his life. Well, the tax collectors also come before God. Two men went up to the temple. One is very proud of his accomplishments. The other is not proud at all of where he is because he doesn't feel good about himself. He doesn't feel good about where he is. In fact, he doesn't even know how to explain what's wrong. He can only say one thing: God be merciful. I'm a sinner. And that's his whole prayer. I couldn't even tell you all the sins I've done. I couldn't even tell you all the things I feel guilty for and the way I feel so wrong and all the things that have been so horrible in my life that I feel like it's all my fault and I have no self-control. I have no way of doing anything right. I have no way of being what you want me to be, God. And I'm failing at every single turn. And every single thing that I've done before, it seems to haunt me and plague me and follow after me. And I haven't made any progress in these things. God be merciful to me because I'm a sinner. I'm a mess. I can't even get my own life together. I can't even control myself, much less anything else. And so, God, I don't even know how to pray. And it's almost the prayer of someone who is so desperate that they don't even know how to explain their own sin to God. I think sometimes we want to say, God, please forgive me of, and then we'll list the sin. This guy doesn't even have, the list is too long. He's just, be merciful to me, because the list is incredibly long. And so he puts himself into the mercy of God, and he asks God to forgive him. It's his repentance. It's his way of saying, I'm sorry, I am who I am. And God, I want to be better. And God, I'm trying to be better. But God, I can't be better. It's going to take you making me better. And that's where Jesus comes in. Because as he prays this prayer, he humbles himself before God. And Jesus' point to the story is God gives grace to the humble, but he's opposed to the proud. He's opposed to the guy who thinks he's done so well. He's opposed to the guy who actually looks really good. He's the one we'd want for the church member in our church, because after all, he looks like he's doing great. And we want him because, man, he's so on top of things. And everything he does is good and wonderful. And I'm not sure we could really want the guy who admits that he's failed today, he's failed yesterday, he's failed the day before, he's failed every single day since he can remember. And he can't even keep himself together. And he just needs the mercy of God. And knowing that that's what Jesus is talking about, it may not be that this man has committed horrible sins, but he feels them. He knows it's his way of approaching God. It's his repentance to God. It's not to claim that, God, I'm doing better. It's to claim, God, I am nothing without you. And I really need your grace to make the transition in my life. The other guy's made his own transition. I'm doing well, God. I have self-control and I am controlling everything in my life. You ought to be happy with me. And God isn't. Jesus says the second man, the one who felt so guilty, went down to his house justified, not the other one. After all, the first guy justified himself. He didn't need God to justify him. He was already saved by his own action. He considered himself righteous. It's when our transition is about the change that occurs in us to go from sin to disciple. From the person we have been that makes so many mistakes and is such a failure, to go from that to being a disciple of Jesus. Now, I don't think we need to stay at that stage either, because this is a little bit risky to say, well, that ought to be our prayer all the time. It may be our prayer a lot of the time, but I realize you ought to move on from that one to, God, I'm thankful for what you've been able to do in my life. Not that I have it all together, because it's all you, God, and you're the one who's done it all. And we're thankful for Jesus Christ. As you look at the man who's humble, he doesn't even seem to say thanks. But that ought to be coming. And the praise ought to be coming. Not as a recognition for what he's done and how much better he is than anybody else, but simply the fact that God has been able to work in his life. And he still feels that same prayer. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I'm doing better today. But it's because Jesus is working, because your Spirit's in my life, and because you're able to make the difference. And so Matthew was making the difference in his life as he was looked at and judged as a sinner, which he was. As Jesus calls him, he no longer stays there. We see him as being one of the 12. We see him as being one of the apostles. We see him as writing the first gospel in our Bible. How incredible is that? To go from where he was to the place where he's now one of the apostles and one of the authors of the Gospels. What a great thing that is for the transition that Matthew has made. to go from the place where he was as a sinner in such bad company to being in the company of Jesus and realizing the greatness and influence of Jesus as he follows him. And likewise, the second two, as they come to stand before God in the temple, we see it's the one who says, I need Jesus. And so the transition is about our need for Jesus and what Jesus is able to do, not the fact that we can do it for ourselves, is we need to go from sinner to disciple and truly follow Jesus.